some background. So Saudi Arabia is located on the Arabian Peninsula in between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. So in the pre-Islamic times, Jahiliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance, it was populated mostly by Bedouins, so nomadic herders, and the religion was largely animist, and there was some Christian heretical groups, a small Jewish presence. So the first story Rahaf tells is the legend of Muhammad. Muhammad was a monotheist who reacted to what he perceived as corruption of the true religion by a synthesis of Christianity with the folk religion. And he wanted to return everyone back to the true religion. So he was sleeping in a cave when an angel appeared to him, Angel Gabriel, and commanded him to recite. And Muhammad did. He wrote, his words were eventually written down into the Quran, which is Islam's holy book. Now, Muhammad received persecution for his teachings, and he fled in an event called the Hijra, which scholars now say is the commencement of the Muslim era in 571 AD. He created what's called the Ummah, or the religious unity, and became Saudi Arabia's religious, political, and military leader. He perceived that God had commanded him to spread Islam using whatever means necessary, so that was violent and non-violent means. He captured Mecca and Medina and essentially built a religious empire. Fast forward to 1744. Arabia still has no overarching government, but has a lot of city-states, each with their own individual princes. One of these princes was named Muhammad bin Saud. He made an alliance with a religious leader named Abd al-Wahhab, who promised bin Saud dominion in exchange for enforcing his own Wahhabist sect of Islam. Now, the Saudi Arabian kingdom at that point disintegrated in 1818, and his descendants were exiled. But in the early 1900s, Abdulaziz returned to reclaim the kingdom. He sought Wahhabi hegemony and established his dynasty to rule its territories through force, through diplomacy, and creating family alliances, much in the same way that Muhammad had hundreds of years before. He organized a Bedouin army called the Ikhwan, which means brethren, and this army embraced the Wahhabi teachings. It was the Wahhabi mission that propelled the first Saudi state to claim so much territory, the territory we now know as Saudi Arabia, and that same Wahhabism now permitted Abdulaziz to unite the disparate tribes of Arabia under one banner, the banner of Islam. Abdulaziz is known in the West as Ibn Saud, and he came to be seen as, quote, the guardian of ritualistic Islam. It is for this reason that he is considered the legitimate ruler of Islamic territory, and his descendants still rule Saudi Arabia today in the Wahhabist tradition.
So when Reem would be asking her sister, like with what Michaela was sharing with earlier, she would ask, what does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be Islamic, like back in Saudi Arabia? And what she would have heard would have been the 5 pillars of Islam, the foundations of what they believe. And this first pillar represented in the center would be this pillar of the proclamation, the same proclamation that Muhammad himself would have made, that was written down, and would have had to recite it 3 times in order to take that first step into becoming an Islamic following Muslim. And then the second pillar would be this pillar of prayer. I know there's a lot of media coverage with this prayer. They pray 5 times a day. That's a basic foundation for the Islamic faith. To pray once in the morning, to pray a second time at high noon, pray a 3rd time before sunsets, pray a 4th time after the sun sets, and then the 5th time anytime before midnight. And then this 3rd one would be this pillar of charity. Every year, every Muslim is called to give 2.5% of whatever they make, solely to give to the poor. And that's outside of any other charitous acts that they do throughout the year. And this 4th one is probably the most common one that we see outside of the praying, which is the pillar of fasting. See, in the holy month of Ramadan in the Islamic faith, this is represented by the month that Muhammad got his revelation from Allah. And during this whole month, everyone is called to fast while the sun is up in the air. So they can eat while the sun's down and eat at nighttime, but while the entire time that the sun is in the sky, they are not to eat, and that's to represent the suffering of the poor and to ultimately show the sacrifice that they're supposed to give to Allah during their life. And the last pillar is this pilgrimage pillar. And ultimately what it is this pilgrimage to their holy city of Mecca. Like Michaela said earlier, that's the place that really Islam was born. It was in the holy city of Mecca. It's very revered and very sacred ground to the Islamic State. And it's easy to ask, like, well, what's a good model for me to follow? What's a good, where's the bar, essentially? And that's basically the bar of living like the Prophet Muhammad did. In the Quran, chapter 33:22, it says that the Prophet Muhammad, that the Prophet of Allah is the role model to follow. He was an excellent model. And so, but here's the problem. The Quran doesn't talk about Muhammad. It doesn't really even name him by name. It only refers to him as a prophet of Allah. And so about 100 years after the death of Muhammad, there was a book series, I believe it was called the Sahih Maktoub, I believe it was called. And all it was records of Muhammad's life, his deeds, his acts, the things he said, the things he taught. So it was taught that in order to be a good Muslim, you are to follow the life of Muhammad to the best of your ability.
Okay, so in moving into communication, in order to understand how Saudi Arabians interact with one another and what the culture expects, you really need to understand that its roots are in Islam. And it's much more of a closed off culture. They don't love influence from outsiders, and while that is changing, they're still heavily influenced by Islam and the roles of women and men within society. They're really indirect in their ability to communicate, so you might make a mistake and they're not going to tell you. They will hint at it in other ways, like becoming a little belligerent when you are having a conversation later about something they may disagree with you on, or just dropping hints in their body language and things like that. Volume, again, displays the roles of men and women. Men often speak loudly and in a rising tone, and you can hear them far away when you're in a social setting, whereas women are expected to be much more reserved and quiet in their interactions, especially in public. And just talking about hierarchy, their status, gender, and age all play a role in the way that Saudi Arabians are able to interact with each other. And so a major example is eye contact. When people of the same gender and status and age are communicating with one another, they are allowed to make more eye contact and do that in a way that like Westerners would, where we are expected to make eye contact in order to talk to people and really show that we're listening. Whereas if I were to talk to my grandmother or someone who is older than me of higher status or a man, I would be expected to look slightly down in order to kind of give off this presence or this vibe that yes, you are of higher authority than me and I'm giving you respect. There's a missing slide. Okay, so there's other aspects of this as well. Physical touch is really huge within Saudi Arabian culture. You might be walking around and see two men holding hands just cause, and that's a sign of friendship there. And they really don't care about personal space. They might be this close to you, and what us Westerners are like, hey, keep at least 3 feet away from me. They're like, hey, yeah, let's hold hands and walk around the streets. And that's a little weird for us. It might be something that's a bit of a cultural clash when going over there. It's also important to understand, again, the roles of men and women, the roles that men and women play within this social situation. It's perfectly acceptable for someone of the same, two people of the same gender to hold hands, hug, interact like that. But it is never acceptable for a man and a woman to embrace or hold hands in public unless they are family. And so that is definitely something that if someone came from an outside culture and was like, oh, I'll just hug this person as a sign of gratitude, thank you for letting me stay there, then that they would probably freak out just a little bit. And there are other things like what they talked about in the Cameroon presentation in giving gifts with your right hand. The left hand is considered dirty, like Islam, and it's expected that you bring a gift of gratitude when visiting others and staying in their house. But there are so many rules around men and women's roles that men are not allowed to give presents to women that might be suggestive of romance, and so flowers would not be an acceptable gift, or anything that could be construed as he's trying to make an advancement at her. So that's Saudi Arabia for the most part. I think takeaways, we've kind of taught you some of the basics, but there's no way that we could teach you everything within 15 minutes. The biggest thing to take away is that when interacting with this culture, it's completely different from our own, and if you're actually going to interact with those people and go over there, you need to not only experience it, but be open to asking questions, doing your own research, because there are so many things that are small and can be regionally different as well. So are there any questions?
Can you talk more about the family aspect of it? Like you said that they're able to be affectionate and touchy with their friends, but not with their wives?
No, so men and women cannot be affectionate in that way or physical in public unless they are family. It is socially acceptable for them to be a little more physical, but even within the culture, they're a lot more conservative than we are, and so public displays of affection really aren't as common.
Does family mean mother and father and stuff like that, a husband and a wife, or mother and their child, their son?
It covers all aspects of that.
Michaela, you said you have some friends here from Saudi Arabia, because you grew up in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, I don't know them here from when I grew up there, but yes, I have some friends here from Saudi.
Do they have difficulties adjusting? Can you tell us a little bit about their time of adjustment here?
Yeah, from what I've talked to them, they grew up a little bit more on the liberal side, so coming here they have enjoyed being able to easily commute and just having a little bit more freedom in public, especially for the women. One of my friends, she does not like to go anywhere without an escort, and that is just to take away from her Saudi Arabian culture, because I understand still at this point women are not allowed to leave the country without a male escort, although that is in the process of changing right now. I do know that sometimes they have encountered anti-Muslim protests if they're walking down Denver, people who are not treating them well, but for the most part they tend to really like living here, and they say that everyone is so friendly and they just love it and don't want to go back to Saudi.
Do they speak English pretty well?
Yes. I know them from studying at the ESL school that's located in Denver.
Joan, I was wondering if you gain a greater respect for the religion after studying it. For example, I never knew that the reason they fasted was out of respect for the poor, or to align with the suffering of the poor. Did that give you greater respect in terms of what the different pillars stand for, or?
Yeah, it did.
Any new thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's with the fasting thing that gives a whole different definition to it. I didn't
I didn't know that
really
either.
understand why they did it until this. But when it comes to talking to a Muslim about their faith, they're all very religious people. They pray a lot and they have that month of fasting. And so it's important to basically know what we believe, because Christianity and Islam have similar histories. Islam is traced all the way back to Abraham's son Ishmael. So very similar roots, and they acknowledge who Jesus was, or that he was alive, not exactly who he was. But so it's they have similar backgrounds, just disagree on key points, and it's important to remember that. But also how their religion gets them to act as people and as followers of Islam.
I do want to qualify that for Saudi Arabia specifically. Their version of Islam is very, very strict, and even though it's seeing a lot of changes lately and the progressives are having a greater influence, find a lot who are really eager to like embrace you find them on both sides of the spectrum. They are like very, very religious and strict, or very eager to embrace the freedoms that is typical of American culture. And like for the Ramadan example, you do have some who are more dedicated and who do fast out of the poor out of respect for the poor. But you also have a lot of instances where it's just an excuse to sleep in all day and then have a big party at night. So there really there's both sides of the spectrum, and I see both very strongly.
Even here?
Here, I can't say to everything because I don't know as many here, but definitely in Saudi.
Any other questions or concerns? One more question from Claudia. Go ahead, Claudia.
Is Saudi under